damn it, Dale.
Here we are. Welcome, Dale Sevan again with Jake Parent. You know, whenever Jake, I always have this. I know you told me it's Jake Parent, but my French Canadian heritage won't let me see that as anything other than Parent. All I can think of is the great Flyers goalie. I think Bernie Parent. So whenever I see it, I'm always like Jake Parent, and then you're right. No, it's Parent. I'm like,
right.
You know, it's funny.
Usually the Canadians they put an EAU at the end as well. They're like Parento.
Oh yeah, that is there was a hockey player, JP Parento, I think, a hockey player.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty common. A common name, but of course I've learned, you know, I go down to my in-laws and they live along, not quite in Appalachia, but pretty close, southwest Missouri, or Missouri, as my father-in-law said. So they're not far from Lake of the Ozarks and all that stuff. But there's a bunch of towns along there, and when I would go down, my wife would be like, "Oh, look, there's El Dorado," and she goes, "Dorado," and I'm like, "What?" Like that's pronounced Dorado. I'm like, "The fuck it is," you know. Right. And then we get further along, and there's a town. I go, "Oh, look, we're passing Nevada," and she's like, "That's Nevada." I'm like, "What the fuck is it with you people?" And so it turns out that when you run out of names, I guess the folks down along Appalachia, they just borrow names from other places, and then they just anglicize the hell right out of it. Like they take out all that pronunciation. Right away.
There's also the little fact of, you know, being from Arkansas, that it's spelled one way, Arkansas, and pronounced another way, and that was literally a compromise, that it used to be pronounced and spelled both ways. So the compromise was they would spell it one way and then pronounce it the other.
Oh, that's interesting.
That is some Arkansas logic.
That's some good shit. Okay, then it's not just me. So anyway, hey, this week there's so much to talk about, and I want to talk about science and more truth-seeking stuff, but there's a great way to segue into this with kind of recent events. So, and Jay hit me up with this. Jay, you want to pull that clip? This is great. I also just like seeing Bernie Sanders get run over by a truck, but
I'm going to make America healthier than other countries in the world right now.
Will you guarantee do what every other major country does? That's a simple question.
And by the way, Bernie, the problem of corruption is not just in the federal agencies; it's in Congress too. Almost all the members of this panel are accepting, including yourself, are accepting millions of dollars from the pharmaceutical industry.
Oh no,
protecting their interests.
No. I thought that would no. I ran for president like you. I got millions and millions of contributions. They did not come from the executives, not one nickel of PAC money from the pharmaceutical industry. They came from workers.
In 2020, you were the single largest
because I had
pharmaceutical money
from workers all over this country. Workers, not a nickel of corporate
tax. You were the single largest acceptor of pharmaceutical dollars.
No, from workers in
1.5 million.
Yeah, out of 200 million. All right, but you have not answered.
You fraud, Bernie. So the RFK is trying to get confirmed as Secretary of Health and Human Services, and that's just funny to watch. To watch Bernie get run over. And I know there are people like probably Bernie bros, people who love Bernie, but if you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you that Bernie cares two shits about poor Americans or the proletariat. You are a fool. Sorry. But I can't coddle you into maturity. You got to grow up and face the facts. So Bernie gets run over by a truck during the RFK hearings. And there were some other like, will you commit to having onesies pull off of the CHD website? And a lot of it centered around this. The Elizabeth Warren clip became famous too. And it's this sort of screaming. Well, first of all, let me offer this thought for Senate hearings and for people who maybe haven't been watching politics like I have. And unfortunately, I have to confess, I'm one of those people that politics for me is like probably the NFL is for other people. But I'll say this, I look at politics more like sport than I do anything serious to get upset about. I treat it more like I feel about, the Bruins played shitty the other night. And I'm like, right. What are you going to do? But it's more like.
It's one of those things that I often tell friends, like, if the person who is elected president affects your life, you have structured your life poorly.
Right. Or you're working in and around that, and you asked for it. You know what I mean?
But
Like,
you've also structured your life poorly. I
right.
think that's what I said.
Yes, correct. All right. Yeah, good point.
You
So
decide to work in a livestock yard and you're upset that you're covered with cow dung. Like,
yeah,
I don't know what
I
to tell
can't
you.
stand the smell. Why is this so stinky?
Right.
You know, you're a farmer.
Right.
You run a hog farm. You do know that, right?
Right.
So first of all, I think people should think of politics. I say this: I enjoy hockey much more than I do politics, because politics is way, way, way closer to WWE, except it's genuinely trying to convince you that it's not kayfabe.
Mhm.
Whereas the WWE and all of that stuff, you know, it's always got a wink and a nod at you. You know what I mean? There's always a
It's still real to me.
yeah. You're from Arkansas, so you have to believe that.
Right.
So anyway, if you're watching politics and you're taking it seriously, you need to understand, specifically when it comes to these senatorial hearings, that what's going on is you should think of this like a little bit like NASCAR. It would really help if everybody politicians, like the top 10 donors that donated to their reelections, if they had to wear a patch like the logo, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like Dale Earnhardt used to, whatever. Like if you had to wear, STP, Penza, if Bernie was wearing his Pfizer patch and Elizabeth Warren had her Novartis or whatever it is, Novo Novordisk thing on, it would be much more accurate, because what you're really witnessing when you're watching those confirmation hearings is you're watching like the WWE. You're watching a script, and the people who are
But everything that Bernie was doing there was, like, in one sense, they were both correct. RFK is correct. Like, hey, you're the largest single recipient of pharma money, and Bernie's trying to define his way out of is by like, no, it was actually through this, that they're sending the money through multiple leapfrogs so that they don't ever have to get that patch put on them.
right.
And
Right. He's trying to deny that he has to wear the patch. But
correct.
but the interesting thing is, yet despite that, he'll scream. It's very important for him to distance himself from having to wear the patch while being able to take the money. But more importantly, is you should understand that his entire thing, or Elizabeth Warren, she actually, I think, recently leads the pack in how much money she's taken from pharma. Anyway,
I think Bernie is a couple $100,000 ahead.
Oh, okay, so it's close. But here's the thing about it: they are performing for their sponsors. In the same way that you might see, you have to understand that senators, it's better to think of a senator like a brand than it is to think of them like a human being who has actual ideas and thoughts, and they've given this serious thought. None of that has happened.
It is, but like there's also, like, is there any amount of money that the NRA could give Bernie to get him to shift his position on that? Like, there are some rock solid positions, but pharmaceutical industry doesn't seem to be one of those for anybody.
Yes, that's exactly what I meant. And so let me back
up. Except RFK
and back into this by saying, this is another example. These hearings are yet another example. They're theoretically supposed to be a truth-seeking endeavor. And they're talking about, so these hearings are supposed to be where you can, the senator is going to get a chance to ferret out, positions of the president's cabinet, and then they can decide honestly about whether they want to advise or consent or whatever. So in theory, on paper, these hearings are supposed to be a truth-seeking endeavor. In the same way that we talked about last time, science is, and music is, and poetry is, and art is, and literature are all truth-seeking endeavors, and religion is, and spirituality is. And so, and these hearings, the court systems are supposed to be truth-seeking endeavors, and this is a kind of form of that. And yet what you really find out, for people watching, what you'll realize quickly if you paid attention to those hearings and watched them for any length of time, and I've been part of some as well, so I'm good. I've done all the research I need to do on this subject. But you quickly find out that really what's going on, and Matt Taibbi and Walter Kern were talking about this on America This Week. I was just watching their show earlier, And Matt seemed to be like, kind of a little bit like, oh, I can't believe Bernie turned out to be, a shill. I'm so disappointed. I'm like, right, because you
Well,
believed
well,
in the
to back up is like is politics, is art, is poetry, are they in fact truth-seeking mechanisms, which they can be, or are they consensus-speaking mechanisms? Like, hey, we're seeking consensus, not necessarily the truth, which is what most science is now. It's peer review is like, does the consensus agree? And as it turns out, I don't need a consensus to agree on gravity. It just
Right. Yes. This is
disagree all you want. You will bump your butt when you jump.
right. Stick a fork in the outlet, and you'll find out about some things about electricity and conductivity that it won't matter what the consensus is about. That you're gonna find out how the consensus crumbles very quickly in the presence of.
So it's in politics. Are we, in the work that I do, awareness and enlightenment is seeing reality as reality is, and it's what is your tolerance for reality? What is your tolerance for the truth? And as it turns out, most people don't have a very high tolerance for that, and they would rather have a comfortable lie than an uncomfortable truth.
Yeah. And so that brings us right into, I wanted to talk this week about science, and I kind of tell a story, and you'll know parts of this and be able to kind of back me up and maybe add to it, which is what Greg Glassman, the former CEO and founder of CrossFit, will always be the founder, but he is the former CEO and former owner of CrossFit. His dad, and this is maybe in some ways will be an explanation. This is another kind of affiliate secret, or what early affiliates I think understood, that the current CrossFit 3.0 or whatever you want to call it now has really just lost all contact with, and that is that CrossFit was an outgrowth of really Greg's dad, and I don't think Greg would shy away from saying this. In fact, I know he wouldn't, because he said that I was at his new house that he's having built in Scottsdale recently, and he said that he calls it the house that Jeff Glassman built. So Greg's dad was a guy named Jeff Glassman, and he was Dr. Jeff Glassman. He never insisted on that, but he started out as a young man. He was a Navy pilot. He was a helicopter pilot, and so, but he was also a brilliant guy who went on to be a rocket scientist. And after he was done flying helicopters, he went to UCLA, got a PhD in system science, and he got another PhD in, I forget what, maybe that was his second one, but from the UCLA Department of Electrical Engineering, and this was in the 60s. And then he went to work for Hughes Aircraft Company, and he was the two-time chief scientist at Hughes Aircraft Company, and he worked on a lot of stuff, a lot of projects. And here's a funny CrossFit story I didn't know until years later. I'd been working for CrossFit as their general counsel for about 3-4 years. We were at the games. And Greg, a lot of people on the internet, you may remember this, Jake, when it happened. Greg said that he was going to bring on his dad, Jeff Glassman, as the chief scientist or chief scientific officer or something like that at CrossFit. And everybody kind of, I don't know if you remember, there was kind of a collective like, what the hell? I made my dad the chief, people made fun of it. And of course, with no understanding that, yeah, it's one thing if you're like, I just made my dad the chief science officer and your dad ran the hardware store. It's an entirely different thing when you make your dad the chief science officer and he may be one of the best qualified people on the planet to actually hold that job. And people, I think, miss that about Greg, is his dad was the two-time chief scientist and chief of internal research and development at Hughes Aircraft Company during their heyday. I mean, when they were the bomb, literally, they were making bombs. And his projects, one of the ones that he ran was the AUG-9 radar, which was the guts of the Phoenix missile system, which is what gave us Tom Cruise flipping the birds to the Soviets and all that thing, all that pageantry and faggotry. But because none of that ever happens, because the whole point was the Phoenix missile system was the first. Greg's old man was a radar guy, and the AUG-9 radar was the first missile that could engage multiple radar system and missile system that could engage multiple targets simultaneously. And it was a sophisticated, it was a leap in technology in radar. And his dad ran that end of it. and then he went over to run the rocket side of it for the actual body that the missile head would go on. So he did both. And he was largely responsible for the AUG-9 radar. For those who don't know, it was a huge advantage for us in the Cold War because our radar could see farther than Russian radar. That's Jeff Glassman. So this whole thing about science and as a truth-seeking function, and it now being a consensus function, is a great observation. It's the thing that Greg's railing about, and his old man always railed about too. But a funny history story is I worked with Jeff Glassman, didn't know it, and find out until years later that he had been the tech advisor on a missile shoot I did, and he was there, and I just didn't connect the dots. But 10 years before I was doing CrossFit, in 1994, I was doing a sidearm missile shoot to test out the sidearm missile, which is an air-to-ground missile that we could fire off the Cobra helicopter. And I was talking to Jeff about it at the games, or he was just talking about projects he worked on, and he was like, "Yeah, I developed sidearm, which was a G-band radar." And so I started, I knew all this shit from having been a pilot and fired the missile. So I was like, "Yeah, G-band radar, against the ZSU-23." He's like, "Sidearm was my project." I was like, "Really?" And then we started talking, and I was like, "I did a sidearm shoot in '94." And then I started thinking about it, and I remembered there was this old guy there, white hair, and he wore a hat, like one of these safari hats. And he was the guy who brought the radar and set it up in the desert. And, and I was like, "Who is that?" And they're like, "That's the technician from Hughes." And so I was like, "Wait a minute." I go, were you at he goes, we started talking. I'm like, "Were you in the desert in '94, 29 Palms?" And he said, he looked right at me and he goes, "The missile went stupid." And it was like he knew something that the only person who could know was somebody who was out there to see that missile shoot when the missile did in fact go stupid. And I was like, holy shit. And so we found out 10 years before I had actually met Greg, his father and I had done a missile shoot together out in 29 Palms, like one of the strangest coincidences. I was like, I should have picked it up then, but it didn't mean much to me. But so the interesting thing
I've recently had a couple stories like this happen with friends in my life where they reconnect with people in odd ways, and they're like, "Isn't that crazy?" And I'm like, "Yeah, either that or the AI that's running our virtual reality is just recycling characters because it's late."
Right. It's run out of new stuff.
Yeah, we're just going to recast. We're going to recast this cameo into a new part in your life.
Yeah. It's like the soap operas. It's the Friends made that. It's not Drake Ramore, it's his twin brother.
Right.
The same actor back in. So
right.
So yeah, it's kind of funny, and so I don't think most people appreciate, even with Metfix. Greg has said like it all of it comes out of his old man. In addition to being a kind of a funny thing about science, he was a brilliant teacher of science. And he got into that field because he was seeing new engineers coming into Hughes, and they had some really funny ideas about science, particularly like you're talking about, that science was consensus. And so he got involved with curriculum in California and wrote a book about it, Evolution in Science by Jeff Glassman. And it's all about the fight between the creationists and the supposed science people, the atheists fundamentally, but the secular humanists who were fighting about whether creationism should be in the what should be taught in the California science curriculum, public school science curriculum. And so Greg's old man was a part of that fight and wrote a book about, and it's really funny because his conclusion was, as a scientist, was that the creationists were far more likable than the lunatics who were driving California's curriculum down the secular pathway. Is that he wound up as a scientist sort of like, yeah, the creationists said not the better maybe of the scientific argument, but they weren't relying on consensus as science. And that was really his beginning part of losing his mind. And so there are going to be people who are watching this and are like, well, science is peer review and you can have peer reviewed papers. And I'm here to crush that and tell you that's all bullshit and that's not science and it's never been science. And Jeff Glassman wrote a paper for the CrossFit Journal that laid all this out, and it's largely become a big part of what Greg's doing with Metfix and BSI. But it's that science is not a process. We were the same age. I don't know if you remember when it went from being like, when they started teaching what they called the scientific method, it was in like middle school. And it was interesting. I told Greg, and I were talking about this the other day, and I was like, yeah, that's when it's just like when you're at the airline and they call it the boarding process. We're going to begin the boarding process. And it's this idea that basically there's just this checklist. and it's like a recipe. You put in a cup of flour, half a cup of water, whatever, and out the bottom, science,
Right.
and that's the scientific method. Like the boarding process, that same thing. We kind of start, we do all these things, and then boarding. You could just say we're boarding now. We're going to begin the boarding process, and if you interrupt the boarding process, we're going to throw you in jail. But they don't say that. So it's this whole managerial, like everything is process driven, and science got kind of, the quick history of it, the early 20th century, so 1900s, early 1900s, science kind of underwent this quiet revolution in academic science in which they denied induction and they denied, in so doing, they broke the foundations of science, and you wind up with science is about how many people agree with me. And p-values, which is complete nonsense. That's a religious rite that's being performed. It proves nothing. And but Jeff wrote this wonderful definition of science that if you run around through all of these current problems in the health sciences and all of that, and to bring this back around to RFK's nomination, there's a moment where Elizabeth Warren, where she's screaming, or one senator screaming at him about, you don't believe in settled science. And you should, if you hear anyone in your life utter the term settled science to you, if you have a bat available near you, you should immediately flog that person and beat them repeatedly. There is no settled science is like, is like saying, what's a good military intelligence? No, that's not. Maybe that's too hard.
So one of the ways that I look at that is one that science is just a map of nature.
Yeah.
And like all maps, the map is not the thing itself, and we're always revising our maps.
Yeah.
Like, hey, we may not be revising them by much. Sometimes we go, hey, this street is actually 20 feet off, and we need to move that over. And nobody who's not a professional cartographer notices, but someone who does, it's very important to them. So that map is just, many people confuse the map with reality itself. And then also at its core, science is an adversarial process. It is designed to be adversarial. It is not designed to be consensus. Hey, I've done this study. Someone else should be able to repeat it. And if they can't repeat it, well, then you're full of beans. So it's not we agree with this. It's like, no, we redid the study. It didn't work.
Yeah, and so you can get all of this from Jeff's. It's one of the most beautiful definitions, and I offer it to people. It's interesting. We're both spiritualists, I'd say, for whatever. I'll just coin that phrase. And spiritual people, yet you live here in the material world. And what I'm going to tell you is there is no conflict between religion and science, not real religion and real science, and there's no conflict between spirituality and science. We live in a material world, and science is a wonderful, wonderful tool for helping us measure just how accurate, holding our feet to the fire publicly, just how accurate our model, our map, to your point, is, just how accurate it is to reality. And the way you do that is with experiments, with trial and error. And so that is why you'll hear Greg rant about this. Predictive power is evidence of and reason for science's objectivity, the sole source of science's reliability, and the demarcation between science and pseudoscience. So predictive power is the determinant of a scientific model's validity, and it provides the only rational basis for trusting it. And the way you do that, you go, and this gets into, really deep philosophy of science shit, but the only way you do it, if people always say, oh, it's subjective and all that, but it's really not. The way we do that is just with the definitions. And Jeff had these beautiful, simple definitions for science that I always loved. He said that, and they do it this way. It's an observation, which is a registration of the real world on our sense or sensing equipment. When you take that observation and you put it against the scale, you tie that to a scale with a known error rate, 3 feet plus or minus 2 inches, 173 people plus or minus 4, whatever. That's now a measurement. So you go from observation to a measurement, and you can also call a measurement a scientific fact. It's an observation tied to a scale with a known error rate. And then what you do is a model maps a fact or a measurement to a current fact or measurement to a future unrealized fact as a prediction. his old man used to call it a forecast of a measurement. I love that. And models are graded, judged by their predictive power. How accurate is your forecast? Just like we do with the weatherman. And they're ranked from conjecture, hypothesis, theory, like the theory of Einstein's theory of relativity, up to law, Newton's laws of motion. So that's how you grade your models. And this applies to, like, people don't realize, courts do the same thing. A prosecutor presents a model, which is a collection of all these pieces of evidence, to a jury of 12. And those people decide whether the model meets the standard beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal trials, or, more likely than not in civil trials. And those burdens are essentially, it's like grading a model. It's the legal system's grading of the model that the prosecution puts forward and says, here's the evidence we have. And our model says what you spit out is this guy violated this law and you give us money, or he violated this law and he goes to jail. And it's an iterative process. It's an inductive method, and it's how our brains work. It's what we've been doing our whole lives. And the whole AI revolution is built on this. The work of a guy named Edwin T. Janes, who was one of Oppenheimer's grad students. And Janes is really the guy who led the way. He had in his book, Probability Theory, The Logic of Science, he talked about a model that essentially, it's called Jane's robot, and it's the forerunner of AI. But it's interesting because it's really about minimizing your uncertainty, assuming as little as possible. And that's the optimal processing of incomplete information. That's how your brain works. And so it's always interesting to me that the people, like you said, the difference between your map and reality is largely your emotional discomfort is usually the difference between your view of what it should be and what it actually is, of anything, of almost. I'm trying to think if that holds generally. I think it does.
Right.
Yeah, so that, when you find something uncomfortable, you find out, like, when you found out a spouse or a girlfriend or a boyfriend or whatever cheated on you. That to me is always the great example, because, if you've ever had that happen, you find yourself having a hard time even trusting. You're like, does my mom love me? Like, you don't even, you're not sure what you can believe anymore. You're like, oh my God, everybody's been, I've been living a lie.
Well, it's that Kaiser Soze moment that forecasts everything backwards as different than you experienced it, and like your lived experience shifts underneath you.
Yeah you no longer, that's the hardest part, is you're like, I guess I can't trust my own judgment. My own sense of, and by the way, this is all related to predictability. To go back to
that's one of those things when we talk about when someone betrays your trust, it's your trust that was betrayed. It's your judgment of them that was wrong,
right? Not
them. And that's right. And that's the thing that becomes difficult, is like, why did I misjudge this situation? Were other people aware of this? Like the number of times you have the spouse, girlfriend, someone else, where you finally break up with them and everybody in your life goes, thank God. And you're like, wait, what? Everybody knew but me? And it's like, yeah, we all knew but you, buddy.
Right. You couldn't see it. Yeah. Well, and so in this kind of this science and broken science and what Greg's doing, we kind of stumbled onto this. He did in talking, it said that predictability is the basis of all trust. All human trust is based on predictability. And you kind of think about it. Yes. He's like, and I like, the more you kind of, and it really is your love for your wife and your kids and anyone in your life is in some sense predicated on your own sense that what they're going to do under any given set of circumstances.
Yes, but the human experience is also the unpredictability. At this point, right. That is the difference.
Well, right.
Us and AI is, what is that intangible, that je ne sais quoi that just pops off every once in a while. You have to stop and look at your spouse and go, what's going on over there?
Yeah. Well, what you're doing is, what's happening is, that's why people want an explanation, is they're trying to find a way to fit the new evidence into their model for that person. and trying to find a way to reconcile or rectify this new evidence in light of, it's like when the guy who, the judge, sober, whatever, and then he gets caught snorting, or the priest who gets caught snorting coke off of a hooker's butt, and you're like, you can't trust this guy. Yeah, you're given everything that's said and what people believed about him, you're incapable of reconciling the reality against the sort of avatar of what you thought they were. But it is the basis for all trust, is predictability.
Yeah, but you also have somebody like I don't know if you've ever listened to Theo Von, his podcast or any of his clips. It's like you literally have no idea what word is going to come out next. Like if there was a predictive text, this is what he is. Not the next phrase, not the next thought. Just hey, can we get the next word right? And you're like, no.
Yeah, well, and that is, it's funny, kind of in the tarot card world. They have that. On the one hand, we want predictability. And yet we also have this recognition, the Loki character, the fool, the jester. Most comedians rely upon that. Monty Python was great for that, just absurdist kind of humor where stuff just comes out of left field, and you're like, like the one where the fish slapping thing where the guys that, in the British uniform comes up and slaps him in the face with a fish. And then he hits him with like a giant mackerel. You're like, what the fuck am I watching? But all of it's brilliant. The coconuts clapping, you're clapping coconuts, So there's we on the one hand we
need to balance certainty and uncertainty. That we need certainty for safety, and if we have too little certainty, we feel exposed and vulnerable, and we get a little tense, a little stressed. But then if we have too much certainty, it's like, hey, it's time to make the donuts.
Yes.
And that gets old, and then you need some uncertainty in your life.
Yeah, there's a great book.
You have to have that balance.
It's a great book. I'm actually going to grab it and show off the title here, but that's relevant to all of this. So William Briggs, and I'm gonna name drop and say uncertainty. And so he's on Substack. He goes by, to his familiars, I'm proud to say I do know the guy. He goes by Matt, but it's Professor William Briggs. And he's a wonderful, wonderful, a brilliant gentleman, and a kind of the intellectual descendant of E.T. James. But the first 4 chapters of Uncertainty are a tour de force, and you don't need any math background. You can get through. There's no. I promise. There's no math in the first 4 chapters. But if you read that, you'll get yourself pretty quickly to an understanding of just how much of our world is spent maybe telling ourselves some things, being a little more certain about things than we probably should. And it's a great, I'm going to do this. My camera's out of focus. It's a great read for anybody.
Well, this is one of those things where I have very strong opinions that are very loosely held. I will pound the table on my position, and then as soon as you give me a scintilla of evidence that points the other way, it's like and pivoting and going in this way.
Yeah, it's 100%. often wrong, never uncertain. That's one of my favorite phrases. But uncertainty, and he's got another book that's called Everything You Believe Is Wrong, and believe is in italics. And this gets to kind of a notion that's got religious overtones. I think the first time it shows up is in like Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, but it's what is justified true belief? What can we say you're justified in believing? And what is knowledge? How do you know something? Can you know something that's false? And there's kind of this philosophical debate, angels on the head of a pin, but I think Briggs does a great job of showing you can't know something false. And out of that, language is huge here as well, but you can really begin to understand and examine. And this is the, like Greg says, it's the most important stuff that's not taught in any school, but things like plausibility, how we go from you're so much better rather than thinking that you've got a complete theory of anything than just assuming as little as possible and then letting the data come to you and then draw tentative conclusions from there. And then, as you said, you just keep updating your map and you tack your way closer and closer for those who
well, to go back to what you were talking about with to go back what you were talking about with the words, that we're basically doing the scientific process there that says there that when I am using words to communicate with you, I am having a conjecture about something that you don't know.
Right.
And then I am using words, I'm making sounds that are going to helpfully fill in that gap, and you're going to guess at what I mean by those words to fill in those blanks of whether that means it or not. It is remarkably that it works at all is amazing, because we're both you're guessing at what I mean, I'm guessing at what you don't know, and then we're having a communication about that.
Yeah, it's incredible that we're even able to communicate at all. This kind of a semi miracle. So there's a great website in the AI world run by a guy, and I disagree with him about a lot of things. Eliezer Yudkowsky, I think it is. He's big in the AI field.
I disagree with him quite a bit as well. Yes.
Yeah, I don't agree, but he's got it's maybe the best title for a website ever. I'm envious of his website title. I wish I'd come up with it, but less wrong. It might be the best title for a website ever for anything. I hope they one day forget to up it, and I'm going to get it. But less wrong, it might be the best story that anybody could, best motto that anybody could adopt for their own life, which is to start with as few assumptions as possible, and then just try to make yourself gradually less and less wrong. And that will do you far, far better than assuming that at any point in your life that you've got the full of the truth. Even in your religious things, even in your religious leanings, you would do better.
I would say that applies to a great many things in life. That when I was a young man, my dad taught me to box, and the number one rule was don't get hit. Doesn't matter what else happens in the match. If the other guy doesn't hit you, you can't lose. Maybe a boring fight, but you're not going to lose.
Floyd, did Floyd know you? Did your dad train Floyd? What the hell?
I think this is one of those things that if you look at boxers who were trained by family members, they have a very defensive, elusive style. And people who were not trained by family members are like, hey, let's get in there and play rock, and rock'em sock'em. But that is one of the things that I've seen in a lot of people is they have that. No, don't touch me, man. My best friend used to joke that I box like Deion Sanders.
Yeah, I've been watching boxing all these years, love the sweet science, and I never considered the styles of boxers who had family members train them. And the obvious logical implication was, yeah, you'd make sure as shit that they were good defenders, right?
Correct. And the people that I know who are most the some of the wealthiest people I know in my life, like the number one rule is like, don't lose money. I don't have to win. Right. I just can't lose.
Yeah. Just be less wrong.
Yeah. Just be less wrong.
It's great. It's a great website. I love it.
Yeah, it is.
So yeah, that's what science is. It's being gradually less wrong, not being eureka, I'm right.
I think it fits him rather well, because if I remember, he's rather pessimistic about AI's ability, and he's focusing. He's got the double negatives there. Like, don't be more right, just be less wrong.
In fact, Yudkowsky came out with a letter in Time, or I think Time Magazine or Newsweek or something, big periodical, legacy periodical, and he came out not long ago, I think last year, about a year ago now, and like last March, and he said that all AI, all research in AI, everything should come to a stop. And this one, it was like GPT like 2 or 3 or whatever. I forget what we're up to now. But he was calling for a moratorium completely on the technology, on the grounds that nobody knew what it would mean if we created a superior intelligence. That it was all black box. Nobody could really say what was going on, and we were risking human extinction. I think he said to me that
it's still all black box.
Yeah, of course. But he was saying his takeaway was, it was a really fascinating thing. He said that super intelligence is what AI would become, would view us, that we would be as insects to a super intelligence. And I was like, that seemed to me to show more about Yudkowsky's view of insects than it did than any predictive power it might have toward, you know what I mean? Like, I now look at insects like, hey, they're hugely valuable. Like worms are, they're not insects, but I mean, worms are hugely important in gardening, and you get better dirt the more worms you have inside. Like,
well, there's also the one. It's like, all right, we put a moratorium on that. Is China going to? Is India
well,
going to? Like the
right. Yeah,
progress doesn't start. We just shoot ourselves in the foot. Is all we do. And
right.
that's not a race you can afford to lose or not compete in.
Yeah.
And then the second part of that is, I had a friend recently that we were talking about AI, and that they're having AI chatbots take over for people on dating apps, and that there's a future point where there's enough data about you that the AI bot can just assume your personality, have that AI bot connect with somebody else's AI bot, live a life into the future, and go, what is the likely probability that you and this person will actually be a good match for a livelihood outcome? And he was very upset. He's like, well, these chatbots are going to be living all these miserable, like, hey, we had 1,000 lives with this woman, and 800 of them were terrible, and 200 were great. You might want to pass on her.
Yeah, it's
if he was upset. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's like what Thomas Seyfried, the great oncologist, cancer researcher who wrote, believes in the metabolic theory of cancer, but he said he does his whole gig is putting these horrific tumors in mice.
Mm-hmm.
And Greg once asked him over like a slice of pizza, like, hey, Tom, what happens if it turns out that God is a mouse? And Seyfried goes, because nobody has given more mice cancer than Tom Seyfried in his pursuit of, and horrific ones. Like his specialty is like aggressive brain cancers, like glioblastomas. And so he's been giving mice glioblastomas by the metric ton for decades now. And he over dinner, he's like, Greg's like, what if God turns out to be a mouse? And Seyfried goes, yeah, I'm probably in trouble. He's like, I'm probably not going to do well. So anyway, back to Yudkowsky.
But the point of that was that the AI, for the AI to look at us, it would have to have a preference for which there was discomfort associated to it, which it just doesn't have. You can say, hey, you have a preference for this outcome based off of this modality that we give you, but it doesn't have morality, it doesn't have pain, it doesn't have feeling, it doesn't have those things. Like if you don't show up tomorrow, the AI is not going to be bummed out for 20 years because it lost its best friend. Whereas you and I might, if our best friend goes, hey, I'm not showing up anymore.
Right.
There's pain, there's discomfort, and the AI never has that. So it's never going to have that. I'm looking at you as a bug, because it doesn't have the available mechanism to do that.
Well, I also said, an interesting thing about it is I looked internally and I thought, he was making an assumption about sentience, and I was thinking, wow, it's really interesting, because he said, my cutoff point for where ethics kind of really begins is sentience. And let me come at it this way: if I step on an insect accidentally, I'm not heartbroken. I don't think anything about it. I do everything I can to avoid hitting a squirrel. I mean, not to running into the other lane, but I mean, I will swerve, and I've spun cars out trying to avoid deer, and and so they're not, how sentient are they? I don't know, sentient enough, good enough for me. I mean, it's not an accident that everybody's horrified in Bambi. You know what I mean? Now, of course, there's personification going on there and all of that, but the point is that our cutoff for ethical decisions, if you call the poison control, if you call a pest control to take care of your vole problem because things are tearing up your yard, that's a very different thing than if I come over and I find you kicking your dog.
Yes.
You know what I mean? One is like, you got to deal with a pest problem. It'd be nice if you didn't have to use traps or poisons, but what are you going to do? The other one is, you're a rotten human being. Anybody who kicks a dog. I mean, we know that serial killers tend to be, a large chunk of them, a high percentage tend to be animal torturers when they're young,
Right.
And so my take on it was, boy, is Yudkowsky telling us something about himself without maybe meaning to, because my view of all living things is, and I judge the ethics of other human beings based on their respect for sentient life,
Right.
And like, I'm not above being hypocritical. Like I've seen cows that, you remember Esther, my paralegal?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
when I was at CrossFit, so CrossFit's first paralegal, Esther Dole, now Esther Spooner, with two lovely young daughters. She was from Kansas, from a farm, and she had a great story about how she grew up on a working farm, and she had a cow, Lewis, and the parents told her, I think it was Lewis, I don't remember, it was like Hugo or something like that, but Lewis the cow, and they told her, don't name him. They were like, don't get used to that, sweetie. And so I recognized that, and she did. She loved him. And then one day she came home and Lewis, she had a check. Her parents gave her a check for Lewis, and Lewis was also on the menu. And she's like that. She was like 13. That's a tough way to find out there's no tooth fairy,
Right.
But,
Right.
we don't think about that as being horrible, but it's the ethics around, to me, around good ethics revolve around respect for sentient life. And so I don't understand Yudkowsky's objection if we have this huge intelligence that somehow it's going to view us as insects. I'm like, why wouldn't they view us with the same respect that we have for other sentient life? Where that's
I think there's not a large swath. I think there is a very powerful minority of people in the world who view humanity itself very dismally. That I think a lot of the environmental crowd is not trying to save the world for people. It's trying to save it from people. Like the best thing that could happen to the world is there were no more people. And it's like, well, that's as it turns out, if we screw this experiment up badly enough and wipe ourselves out, the world wouldn't even notice in 100 years. Like in 100 years, if we disappeared, most of what we've created would be gone.
Well, there's a funny part to all of this. Having studied astronomy, a hard science when I was young, 17, 16, you do have this amazing kind of schizoid kind of analysis where I was looking at stars of a particular class. And you start looking at the life, we've got enough images in outer space of the stars, so we really can see the life cycle of a star, most stars. And there's a period, where stars are A class, that's a young star, and then B class is a little more mature, and they get older, and you get to G class stars. And what happens is as stars get older, they get bigger and flabbier. They kind of, just like everybody else, like us, they start to get bigger, and their cores grow, and they get big enough, they get huge. And so the reality is that our star will at some point get to be a G-class star, and the Earth will be swallowed. Very likely, the sun will expand to a point where there'll be no Mercury, there'll be no Venus. Those will have been swallowed by the sun, and then it will collapse in upon itself and go supernova. And so this whole thing's got a time limit. We've got an expiration date, on the milk here. So the idea, that it's always strange to me, environmentalists, because there seems to be this notion that we're going to protect Mother Gaia from the horrors of humanity. And I'm like, Mother Gaia is going to get, like everything else, is going to get turned into molten, it's going to get swallowed by the star. So what exactly are you protecting it from? And so what it really comes down to is your point, that what's really going on, if you get honest with people, you talk about this stuff, is it's a self-hatred. It's a loathing of humanity. It's not a love of nature. It's a, oh, look at what people are doing. Like the whole thing about drilling for oil. Like, who cares? You know what I mean? Like, this is what we got. What, you got other ideas? You're going to go out into outer space and find something to make fire with? And I wouldn't save oil buried in the ground. I wouldn't kill a single human being to preserve a dead thing. In fact, I always laugh. Oil, the discovery of oil, may have been one of the great humanitarian achievements, and it saved the species of whales. Read that book, Into the Heart of the Sea, and you'll be amazed at the markets. We were fishing whales to extinction, and then right at the moment when it looked like whales were going to die, we discovered oil in Texas, and the whale.
We moved to kerosene first, and then after kerosene, then we went to heavy and light crude. Yeah.
Yep. But those things, the dead dinosaurs or whatever you believe it is, I don't even believe that's what that stuff is. But the oil that comes out of the ground saved whales. Like, people may not like that, but John D. Rockefeller saved more whales.
Well, it also saved, like, hey, if we had to get around in cities now by horse, like the amount, the size of the horse dung piles would be enormous. Yeah. And you can't use horse dung as fertilizer for like a year.
Right.
You know, the nitrogen levels in it are too high. It's not really usable for anything. It has to age out. So it isn't like, oh, we'll just, you know, put it back on the earth and it'll be fine. It's like, no, it burns everything to death it touches. So
besides the obvious stank. Yeah, it's funny. What you get out of the modern environmental movement largely is a Luddite self-loathing that would like to see humanity extinguished. You know, it's a crazy, and these are the people who are positing themselves as the champions of science. You know, the AGW crowd, all of that. I mean, that's where science has got to, which is probably a good place to end it on. There's real science out there. What Greg's doing at BSI, and I'll probably be there with him, so I don't mind pimping for it. But that is really about teaching people, and I'm working on it for him. We're going to put together some curricula so that you can, like, plausible reasoning is one of the greatest things never taught by this guy Polya, and it's got Henry David.
Yes, to set the table for people. What's BSI? What's BSI?
Broken Science Institute, or what BrokenScience.org. What Greg's doing. And Broken Science Initiative, not Institute. He went with Initiative, Broken Science Initiative. But there's this great line about propositions. All of life is conditional probability. And Henry David Thoreau had a great line. He said that some propositions have more inferential power than others. As in, when a fish is found, when I find a trout in the milk. And Greg and I use that in shorthand for, there are some propositions that carry a lot more weight than others. And inductively, they may not prove anything, but they prove some things. And they make some things less likely and some things more likely. And if you find a trout in your milk, it didn't swim upstream to get there. You know what I mean? Like there's certain inferential things that come out of that. You know, it didn't spawn in the cottage cheese and then make its way, up to the milk. You know what I mean? Like, if there's a trout in your milk, you've got some questions. Or like I said, my favorite one is, or if there's a dead body in your living room.
Right.
You know, it doesn't prove that you're the killer, but you probably should have a good fucking alibi.
Right.
You know, I mean, if you've got a dead body in your living room.
Evidence is what it is. Proof is the story you tell around the evidence. We should better come up with a different proof real quick.
Yeah. So anyway, there's the beginnings of probability theory and the logic of science. But I don't know, Jay, did you want to hit one other thing? I know you wanted to talk about Kash Patel. I figure we can work Kash in.
Yeah, let's work him in right now. I'll go ahead and cue that up for you. I'd love to get your take on it. The reason why I picked this clip because one side of the aisle seems to be casting these spurious accusations, and then you have the other side of the aisle, which in this case, it's much more of a positive, uplifting message. So let me share that with you guys right now and see what it triggers.
Yeah.
1 second.
Now, I want you to think hard before you answer my next question. Do you believe in the adage that two wrongs don't make a right, but they do make it even?
I mean,
Senator, I think if anyone commits a wrong in government service, the American public deserve to know the absolute secular detail of that corrupt activity.
When reforming the FBI and the Justice Department, two wrongs don't make a right, but they do make it even is the wrong approach, isn't it?
That's correct.
And we're going to hold you accountable for that.
I hope you do.
Now, there's some good people at the FBI.
Lots.
And there have been and may still be some bad people there. And you've got to find out who the bad people are and get rid of them in accordance with due process and the rule of law. And then you've got to lift up the good people.
Yeah, sure.
Don't go over there and burn that place down.
Oh, don't be weak.
Go over there and make it better. Do you commit to us today that you will do that?
I commit to you, if confirmed, Senator, every single day, 24/7, 365, the FBI will be the premier law enforcement agency in the world.
Shouldn't exist. There, how's that? He probably believes that and doesn't want to say it. But yeah, I mean, how do I feel about it? I don't know. Hey, Jay, you know me. Like I said, if I were made the head of the FDA, the only question that there would was whether or not I would put the chains, I would give notice to the staff in the building before I chained the doors and lit it on fire. That's what I think about that organization, in case anybody's wondering. Same for
I think this is one of those things where many people are saying, hey, sorry about the lawfare. Let's all be friends now. And get along. And I don't agree with that approach. I also understand Senator Kennedy's statement that like two wrongs don't make a right. But in the course of that lawfare, in the course of going forward, that people are going to be in. I do not take politics very seriously, mostly because I think the Republicans largely play the part of the Washington Generals to the Globetrotters of the Democrats, where they're just the foils who constantly get beat upon. And I think that's over. That they're playing to win now, and that winning doesn't mean that, hey, we're going to commit a wrong, we're going to commit violations to go after you, but like, you've done things that were inappropriate in the past. We're going to explore that. We're going to investigate it. We're going to prosecute it. I largely think that is for most of my life, that has certainly been a greater fiction than any romance novel, that the Republicans were actually going to investigate and prosecute somebody for government malfeasance. I mean, hey, the statute of limitations hasn't run out on Hillary Clinton for deleting her servers and running a private server for government business. Let's go prosecute that. I'm not saying that we will, but there has been a lot of selective prosecution, and I am for prosecuting everybody in the government.
My time in China, I tell you, I came away, and I came away with some interesting lessons, but one of them was right when I got over there was this big corruption investigation, huge scandal with a party official and his wife. And that seems to be how it runs in China. It's not just the party official. Whenever they make an example, it's the party official. It's always the party official and his wife. And they wound up both getting executed. And it was this huge thing, like about how they were using all this. They were living these lavish lifestyles and kind of, not acting befitting a member of the party kind of thing. And it was the equivalent of like a senator getting executed, and that happens about, if you look in even modern recent Chinese history, it happens about every 6 to 10 years. Oh, by the way, I also have some great ideas about budget, helping with the current budget deficit. And I think that if we could convict senators or politicians, government officials of high crimes or whatever that were if we were like that doesn't really deserve death, anything less than sort of, death penalty level stuff, that we should have stockades on the National Mall. Like I would move the Vietnam Memorial or something, you know what I mean? Like somewhere near the reflecting pool. Right. I would have stockades where government officials would serve part of their sentence would be just a weekend. They would have to come in and you'd have to be there, and they would be in the stockades, and then the government would have these rotten fruit things, like of tomatoes and rotten, not hard fruit that could do any harm, but rotten tomatoes and shit like that, vegetables. Mm-hmm. And you could pay $1 and you could throw them at the government officials. And I'll bet you could get a line all the way around the fucking National Mall. And at $1 a hit, you know what I mean? And you do that for a weekend, I bet you could make back a lot of money. I mean, I would sponsor people. Fuck, I would put part of my salary towards every week. It would be like a direct deposit.
Well, I think you're under, as a good capitalist, I think you're undercharging for that. I think we need 10, it needs to be at least $100.
Yeah, $5 for 3 shows. Yeah,
let's make it $100. Like, hey, we'll put you on C-SPAN. You get to throw some fruit. Like, let's church it up.
It would, you'd have cameras there like C-SPAN. The cameras would just be running. Just be a live feed, because there would be something to be said too for just watching those miserable curs just sit there and cry, and like even if nobody was throwing anything, they were just like just watching them bleat in the stockades, and you do it for 72 hours or so, or just whatever, like 24 hours. Maybe you do it in shifts. You know what I mean? You only have to stand there for an hour, and then we'll take you out because we're not cruel. The next asshole goes in, and we just do that 24. They do it over like if they made that over Memorial Day weekend, I would feel like my brother's souls were getting more joy than any flag thing or putting flags. I really believe, I know, knowing those guys well, I think they would be much, their souls would be a lot more at rest if we were doing that. I believe that. What do you think of that? You think that's viable?
I don't think it's viable, but I do think that, you know, I'm a little bit more towards the Warren Buffett, like, hey, if we pass an amendment that says, hey, if the budget's not balanced, you don't get to run for re-election. Like, I think we would see some real Thunderdome politics taking place then, that instead of everybody being real cordial to each other, it's like, oh no, now we have something on the line that we have to fight for.
Well, you know, we could combine, you know, these ideas could be combined, Jake, where you go, if the budget is not balanced by X date, if you don't present a balanced budget, then it starts off like no congressional salaries. And then it turns into like, okay, if it goes another month, then you can't run for re-election. And then the next month is the fruit thing, is the rotten tomatoes. You know what I mean? Like, so we could scale this appropriately. And then what we're doing is we're actually making money back into the public fisc.
Yeah, and it would be nice to see politicians turn into penny pinchers and questioning every Beatles study that is like done.
Right. Yeah. Once you can rob from the future, man, it's over. That's really the problem. Jay, I think that's it for the week, buddy. I think we've said about all we can say before somebody has us arrested.
Damn it, Dale.